All right. Hello, everybody. I am Jayme CheeseSlice. That was Grand Cross by Ringmaster. That's Gloria's old band. And happy Thanksgiving, everybody. Thank you for joining us to watch our show today. We're just keeping our schedule like normal. So we're going to have an interesting show today to talk about COINTELPRO in Eastern Europe with Shaenah Batterson. I hope I got the last name right. But what we are doing here on this show, if this is your first time ever seeing it, we are recording a radio program. And instead of just doing it behind the scenes, we're doing it live here on YouTube. So you can see the entire show on live and uncut. But after we do the show, I'm going to take it and edit it and make it work for the radio. So you get to watch our process and see how we do things here. So that's the plan. We're going to record for about an hour. Let's go ahead and bring on our hosts, Gloria and Jayme. How are you guys doing today?
Hey, everybody.
Good to see you. I hope we're ready to go. And then we're going to try to run through this hour quickly so we can get on the turkey. And let's bring in our guests. Shaenah, how are you doing?
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Oh, we're glad to have you. All right. Gloria, take it away.
Hey, everyone. Welcome to Uncontrolled Opposition, where together we battle Guillo, an investigative journalist, and I'm here with my co-host, Professor Jayme Kuzmarov, managing editor of Covert Action magazine. Our producer and engineer is Jayme CheeseSlice. The opinions you hear are ours and that of our guest, not those of WBAI, the Pacifica Foundation, or the Progressive Radio Network.
Gloria, I need to stop you. Can you restart it? I accidentally muted you.
Oh, okay.
So I didn't want to you getting too far. So go ahead, start over. Take it from the top.
Hey everyone, welcome to Uncontrolled Opposition, where together we battle mind wars with truth strikes. I'm Gloria, Guillo, an investigative journalist, and I'm here with my co host, Professor Jayme Kuzmarov, managing editor of Covert Action magazine. Our producer and engineer is Jayme, CheeseSlice. The opinions you hear are ours and that of our guest, not those of WBAI, the Pacifica Foundation, or the Progressive Radio Network. This content is intended for informational and educational purposes only and should not be interpreted as professional or legal advice. Listeners are encouraged to form their own opinions. Today's guest is Shaenah Batterson, writer, social analyst, and co host with Max Parry of the podcast Captive Minds. Their podcast, Captive Minds, discusses CIA interference, political trends, U.S. imperialism, and geopolitical events from a working class perspective. Yes, folks, they are our twins separated at birth. Today, we will be discussing COINTELPRO in Eastern Europe with Shaenah. She just wrote a comprehensive article that will appear soon in Covert Action magazine titled Operation Splinter Factor CIA Subversion in the Eastern Bloc. As we often discuss, information is used by the predator class as an instrument for maintaining control domestically and for consolidating power geopolitically. Let's consider the mechanisms employed by Western institutions during the mid 20th century and their echoes in contemporary digital landscapes. These tools ranged from Radio Free Europe in the 1940s to 1960s to the FBI's COINTELPRO operations domestically to social media orchestrated color revolutions in Eastern Europe and the Middle East. Note that they all reveal a pattern. Regional and cultural differences are exaggerated to legitimize economic and political hegemony, while also neutralizing human rights advocacy both at home and abroad. This is less of a clash of ideologies than a calculated effort to preserve corporate interests by designating adversaries, real or contrived. Let us begin with Radio Free Europe, established in 1949 under the auspices of the CIA's National Committee for a Free Europe. While promoted as a beacon of uncensored news for Eastern Bloc nations, Radio Free Europe functioned as a conduit for narratives that amplified the Soviet Union as an omnipresent menace while showcasing U.S. culture's glitz and glam. Further, by broadcasting reports of internal repression and external aggression, it rationalized vast military expenditures and interventions to the American public. And in doing so, paved the way to extending markets for American corporations in Europe and beyond. This was an opportunity to portray any alternative economic model as a bogeyman, and it justified the suppression of domestic labor movements and decolonization efforts that restrained resource extraction and trade dominance. Radio Free Europe's one directional broadcast, So Distrust, enabled Western capital to penetrate post war reconstructions under the guise of liberation. Whenever we hear liberation or democracy, we know we're being played. Domestically, this strategy manifested in COINTELPRO, the FBI's counterintelligence program from 1956 to 71, which targeted civil rights and anti-war activists. Many believe this program was renamed and remains ongoing, especially with controlled opposition, as we often discuss on our show. Here, the threat was internal dissent. Figures like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the Black Panther Party were framed as subversive elements, not for ideological purity, but for challenging systemic inequalities that underpinned corporate exploitation. Tactics included forged documents, media smears, and infiltration to fragment coalitions advocating for racial justice and economic equity. By invoking national security, the program stifled movements that could disrupt labor hierarchies or corporate profits, illustrating how manufactured enemies serve to erode civil liberties. Fast forward to the 21st century's color revolutions, uprising in Georgia, Serbia, Ukraine, Belarus, Lebanon, Myanmar, and the Arab Spring, where social media platforms amplified similar dynamics. Funded by US backed NGOs like the National Endowment for Democracy, these events leveraged Twitter and Facebook to mobilize crowds against regime resistance to Western corporate resource theft, otherwise known as neoliberal reforms. The bogeyman here were leaders focused on national sovereignty, but they were instead portrayed as barriers to freedom. The, out, the outcome opened doors to Western investment and resource control while sidelining indigenous human rights agendas that conflicted with corporate agendas. From these epochs, continuity lies in the strategic deployment of information to fabricate perils, crimes, waste, and mismanagement, which thereby rationalize foreign dominance. From Radio Free Europe's analog waves to COINTELPRO's covert files and social media algorithms, the apparatus has grown more interactive, yet the objective endures: safeguarding corporate ascendancy by quelling threats to the status quo. In this light, human rights campaigns, whether foreign, decolonialization, or domestic equality, become collateral casualties in a perpetual quest for control. As scholars of hegemony might observe, such operations underscore the interplay between state power and vulture capitalism, reminding us that the true threats are often not in the designated enemies, but in the architecture of influence. Let's not allow our government to invade and occupy Venezuela for regime change to steal its vast oil reserve and key minerals under the threat of drug trafficking, which is a fallacy. Thank you. Shaenah, please tell our audience what inspired you to study COINTELPRO tactics in Eastern Europe, and then please walk us through your article and extraordinary research.
Great, Gloria, and thank you so much for having me. I hadn't ever heard of Operation Splinter Factor before until I was reading Killing Hope, written by William Blum, which is all about US military and CIA interventions since World War II. And in the book, which has a lot of different sections, he had one section about Operation Splinter Factor. And I, at the same time, was reading another book. I was reading The Devil's Chessboard, Alan Dulles, the CIA, and the Rise of America's Secret Government by David Talbot. And in that book, too, he also mentioned Operation Splinter Factor. So that inspired me to start looking into it, and I discovered that originally it was a book of the same name, published in 1974, I believe, written by British journalist Stuart Stephen. So I got that book and read that book, and the story of the operation sounded very plausible to me. But as I started to research it further, because I decided I wanted to write about it, I found a lot of multiple reviews dismissing the claims of Stephen's book. But it turns out, for example, one such review I found archived in the Houston Post that said there was no such operation as Operation Splinter Factor. The author of the review actually had formerly been employed by the CIA. And in another review I found, which said that the book Operation Splinter Factor was one of the worst books written in the field of intelligence, the author was also formerly a CIA official. So the gist of Operation Splinter Factor was that Alan Dulles after the Yugoslavia split with the Soviet Union, Alan Dulles, who was the first head of the CIA and very well known for his intelligence career, and he was really, in some respects, one could say, a Nazi sympathizer, and had some very dubious activities in his past. But his idea was he wanted to make the rest of the Soviet satellites, because, after World War II, communist governments came to power in Eastern Europe, and Dulles wanted to make the rest of the Soviet satellites go the way of Yugoslavia and split with the Soviet Union, as to weaken the Soviet Union and create instabilities in the region. Really, I think he got this idea when, in 1948, a high-up man in the Polish security apparatus, Joseph Swiatło, met with an MI6 agent and expressed his wish to defect to the West. The MI6 agent wasn't sure whether he was genuine or this was a Soviet trap, so MI6 decided to turn over Swiatło, still recognizing the intelligence importance that, if he was genuine in his wish to defect, would present, decided to turn him over to Alan Dulles, who at the time was working in the Sullivan and Cromwell law firm and not officially doing intelligence work, although it is rumored that he was running intelligence operations in Eastern Europe even during his time at the Sullivan and Cromwell law firm. So anyways, Swiatło was turned over to Alan Dulles, who, instead of encouraging him to publicly defect to the West, ordered him to remain at his post so as to be a mole on the inside. It is, in Stephen's book, he says that he thinks that Swiatło's one of his reasons for wishing to defect was he was having some sort of political competition with another official and named Jacob Bertman. And actually, prior to his defection, Swiatło had compiled a dossier on Jacob Bertman, who was the second most powerful politician in Poland, second only to the president. And Swiatło wanted the president of Poland, Bolesław Bierut, to launch an investigation into Berman, but Bierut defied his expectations and instead ordered the arrest of Swiatło's personal informants. So Swiatło was thwarted in trying to take down his political rival, and then after that was when he expressed interest in defecting to the West. So it is, rumored that was some of why motivated his defection. But anyways,
I thought one thing that you had in your article, which hopefully will come out in the next couple of days in Covert Action magazine. I think there was a little, hiccup in it being published in time for the show, but was what Dulles's role in the OSS, that he was always connected. He was, and the OSS is the precursor to the CIA, Office of Strategic Services, and he was the Zurich chief. Yes. During the split with, Tito and Stalin. And the other thing that came out is that the OSS was supplying Tito with some supplies and resources. So I think, maybe they had a hand in that split too, because Tito knew that, there was another funding stream for him. I'm sure it emboldened him, at least, that there was other opportunities besides Stalin. So, they might have even had a hand in that too. And he certainly has, a long history with intelligence, before the CIA. Thanks.
Yeah, that's definitely possible. And speaking of Dulles's time in Zurich, that is where he met the other important character in what would become Operation Splinter Factor, really who allowed the whole operation to transpire, which was Noel Field, who was a former U.S. government employee and fellow traveler. He had a Quaker background and had worked in the State Department in the 1930s, assisting Jewish and anti-fascist refugees. And it's purported that the Soviet Union tried to recruit him for spy work, but he never ended up doing it. Although there are certain books that say he was a spy for the Soviet Union, but really with what transpired, it doesn't make any sense that he was. But he left the State Department in 1936, turning down the job of officer in charge of the German desk to work for the League of Nations. And during his time at the League of Nations and the Spanish Civil War, he helped foreign fighters repatriate to their home countries after Franco's military victory. But he was also, during World War II, employed with the OSS, to take part again in the offensive against fascist Germany. And that is where he came into contact with Alan Dulles in Zurich. So after World War II, Noel Field remained in Eastern Europe. He was trying to get a visa in Czechoslovakia, but as early as 1948, the Czechoslovak security authorities were suspicious of Field and kept him under surveillance, because of his work with the US government and his close connection to Alan Dulles. When Field visited Poland in 1949, he presented Dulles and C.I.A. with the opening they needed to create a panic within the Soviet security apparatus. And this was sort of really where Dulles developed Operation Splinter Factor, the gist of which consisted that Noel Field was slandered by Swiatlo and other Western-backed plants as a Western intelligence agent, so as to ignite a purge of the most competent communist officials who, because of Field's refugee work during World War II, he had become acquainted with prior to their coming to power after the war. And because of Field's broad connections, once he was slandered as a Western agent, it looked like there was this network around him, which was this sort of grand anti-Soviet conspiracy. As in Slovakia, the Polish authorities had viewed Field as a compromised character, and when he wrote a letter to Jacob Berman, Swiatlo's political rival, requesting help obtaining a job in the Eastern Bloc, it was a golden opportunity for Swiatlo to implicate Berman in an alleged anti-Soviet conspiracy. After this, Field was arrested and
Well, and for our viewers to understand the significance of this, I think what she's saying is that they set this guy up. Field was clearly an agent. Actually, he was. We had another guest. He was a key figure in the Alger Hiss case because they used him. He fingered out Alger Hiss as this great spy. We know he's an agent because we know that was a covert operation to undermine Alger Hiss and to destroy the left in the United States and the factions in the State Department that wanted peace with Russia. But I think what your research showed that he was outed as an agent deliberately so that anybody associated with him was suspect in those Eastern European countries, and the whole operation was to get to fuel suspicion, which is exactly what COINTELPRO, they did this in the American left and in the radical black groups and the anti-war movement, to be suspicious of informants and infiltrators and to get them to turn on each other. And that's a way to weaken and destroy these movements and these governments, because and it did, because they lost the public relation war because you had these show trials where they looked like they're really oppressive, and America could present themselves as this great democracy fighting against these totalitarian governments. And as you say, they're purging some of the best officials because they were set up to be connected with this guy Noel, and this was all by design, that they would out Noel and then discredit these people who are actually patriots. So it's in some ways an ingenious operation, and I would argue it persists to this day because historians continue to teach this history in a very biased way and present the communists as the bad guy and a totalitarian, and look at these horrible show trial and oppression of Stalin, and they leave out the whole history you're describing, how the manipulations of the Dulles and the Western intelligence services, and even left-wing or revisionist historians who are more critical of U.S. foreign policy in the Cold War don't address this. aspect of the history, which forces us to rethink this Cold War binary. So I think that the broader significance, wouldn't you say?
Yes, definitely. And it's interesting you mentioned the Alger Hiss trial because Field was arrested, and that all sort of transpired a few weeks before the Alger Hiss trial took place. And it's interesting because the dominant narrative we're presented about the quote show trials in Eastern Europe is that it was like Stalin was just this deranged dictator who was going on a rampage to purge any mildly nationalist politicians. And actually, prior to the whole provocation with Field and this sort of, because Stephen alludes to the fact in his book that there was more than just C.I.A, there was sort of a network of double agents who were engaged in feeding disinformation to the Soviet leadership, backed by the CIA. But prior to the whole thing with Field, politicians that exhibited nationalist tendencies were usually just removed for their posts. They weren't arrested. And two, it's debated whether, a lot of the victims of the quote show trials were actually really loyal to Moscow politicians who got caught up in the ensuing paranoia. And two, actually, the for example, the president of Czechoslovakia, Clement Gottwald, was careful and didn't and was careful about accusing his fellow politicians, and Stalin too expressed caution in just arresting people who had been slandered as being an agent. For example, Czechoslovakia was the most affected at this period, and many military leaders and even generals were arrested. But actually, it is alleged in Stephen's book that Dulles specifically planned to target Czechoslovakia because he thought it would be the easiest of the Eastern Bloc countries to incite into an anti-communist rebellion. But the president of Czechoslovakia, Clement Gottwald, who actually, in a CIA memo from a year or a little bit earlier, had thought would be purged because of his nationalist tendencies, he actually remained at his post until his death. One of the most prominent politicians loyal to Moscow in the Eastern Bloc was really targeted by Dulles and Operation Splinter Factor because he was sort of believed to be holding the country together with his iron-fisted tactics. It was the Czech Communist Party General Secretary Rudolf Slansky. And so as this was sort of transpiring with it was coming out that he was somehow connected to Noel Field, and there was a sort of panic about it within the security apparatus there, Clement Gottwald wrote to Stalin about whether or not what to do about Slansky, because it was possible that, or at least they thought it was possible he was a Western agent and really he was being slandered. But Stalin wrote back that in a letter dated from July 24th, 1951, that, quote, "We still believe that statements of offenders with no supporting facts cannot serve as a basis for accusing leaders known for their great positive work. Our experience in struggling against the enemy suggests that proven offenders resort to slandering honest people, thereby trying to sow mutual mistrust among party leaders," close quote. So there you can see there's even seems like Stalin himself had kind of a suspicion that maybe something a little bit weird was going on. Another thing is that Stephen in his book claims that there was a professor at the Georgetown University, which is known to have connections to the CIA, and that had someone there who would write letters to politicians in the Eastern Bloc to somehow like make them look guilty by association. But to return to the central thread of Operation Splinter Factor, Joseph Swiatlo defected publicly to the West in early December, or well, not, it wasn't publicized, but he actually defected to the West and stopped working as a mole in early December of 1953, although his treason wasn't made public in Poland until October 1954, when the Polish press agency labeled him as a traitor and provocateur. However, he was heard by the world in March of 1954 when he suddenly appeared on Radio Free Europe, and he gave all this inside information as to how the Polish security apparatus operated. And actually, Radio Free Europe aired 170 radio programs featuring Swiatlo, and in addition to the numerous radio programs, 800,000 copies of leaflets based on his testimony were dropped by air over the Eastern Bloc, which were entitled Behind the Scenes in the Secret Police and Party, and published by the CIA-funded Free Europe Press. Even the story of Swiatlo's escape to the West sort of bears the mark of a pre-planned intelligence operation. Swiatlo claimed that he and his chief at the time, Anatol Fejin, were in East Berlin for a conference, and that one day they accidentally found themselves in West Berlin and enjoyed it so much that they went in secret again the next day. And his, quote, day of escape occurred when we simply marched over to the American authorities and reported that he wished to defect. Inconsistencies arose, and on a different occasion, Swiatlo stated that the Stasi security chief in East Berlin, Colonel Erich Mielke, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, was his traveling companion, but most other sources concur that Swiatlo and Fejin were on an important security mission to consult with Colonel Mielke, upon which Swiatlo slipped away to the U.S. military mission in West Berlin. From there, he was transported to the U.S. authorities in Frankfurt, and by Christmas of 1953, Swiatlo had been flown to Washington, D.C. Upon arrival stateside, he was thoroughly debriefed, and his interrogations are said to have amounted to approximately 50 long reports. Given the clouds around his defection and the way in which the U.S. government had granted him political asylum, it's not unlikely that he was lifted out after his work was done, because when he originally came about wanting to defect to the West and Dulles told him to stay as a mole, it was promised that he would be lifted out when his work there was done. So that sort of, looks like that's what ended up happening. But it's interesting because, as I said, a lot of the articles say that there wasn't such a thing as Operation Splinter Factor, yet that doesn't make sense because of the CIA's general attitude of intense secrecy surrounding Joseph Swiatlo, and Noel Field. Like, for example, Flora Lewis, who wrote a book called Red Pawn, the story of Noel Field, where she claims that he was a spy for the communists, but even she noticed that she ran into what she called an official barrier of silence when she requested information about dates and places regarding Field from American, Swiss, French, British, and German intelligence agencies, and the CIA refused her any access to information on Swiatlo. And actually, later on, multiple professors, including even the historian who I really do not like, Timothy Snyder, have put in FOIA requests to the CIA for documents pertaining to Swiatlo, only to be rebuffed. And actually, in 2005, Snyder corresponded with Scott Koch, who was the information and privacy coordinator of the CIA at the time, appealing the denial of his FOIA request. And in a rare moment of integrity, Snyder pointed out the absurdity about concealing facts about Swiatlo, given that he had been dead for so many years. Actually, even the whole around his death, prior to the U.S. declassifying the information in 2010, that Swiatlo passed away in 1994, the date of his death was contested as broadly as being from either the late 60s to as late as 1985, with some even saying that he had plastic surgery and changed his name. Anyways, Koch denied Snyder's appeal, and even another professor put in a Polish professor put in a FOIA request specifically asking about Swiatlo's potential contact with U.S. intelligence prior to his defection in 1953, which the CIA informed the professor that, quote, the CIA can neither confirm nor deny the existence or non-existence of records responsive to your request. And when the professor attempted to appeal the CIA's decision, he was told that we regret to inform you that we mistakenly granted you appeal rights. So you can see that there's this whole very strange attitude around Joseph Swiatlo, and it's hard to even find any information on him at all. Interestingly, there are other things written about Operation Splinter Factor in Slovak, actually, and a Slovak foreign policy journalist by the name of Leopold Moravsik has written about the operation in his book, which is not available in English, but it's called Conspiracy Against Conspiracies, which apparently he also talks about the Kennedy assassination in. And I used, at the beginning of my article that I wrote, I used the attitude around the Kennedy assassination to sort of help with the rest of my point, because any questioning of the Kennedy assassination was dismissed as a conspiracy theory, which, the CIA promoted this idea of dismissing anything questioning its narrative as a conspiracy theory.
And in Eastern Europe, I would have the sense that that the people of Eastern Europe may not be aware of this history either. I mean, they turn hard to the right now. You have these a lot of extreme right wing governments in Eastern Europe that present themselves as anti-communist, anti-Russian. Uh, and so, what would you say about that? How this history, I mean, it's clearly suppressed in the United States, and, kids and I think college students. Well, we've had programs on the CIA continued infiltration of higher education and the biased education that students receive, especially in this kind of area of Cold War history, because, the implication that there's still very clear implication given the U.S. is still fighting a new Cold War with Russia. But my question relates to Eastern Europe. I mean, are these programs known at all in Eastern Europe? And what are the veil of secrecy there?
Well, I would say, from at least what I researched, there was a few articles written about Operation Splinter Factor in Slovak and also in Bulgarian, but just from what I generally know, for the most part, it does seem like the general political situation in Eastern Europe that a lot of the people there aren't aware of this history and sort of grew up on the lying being fed to them by Radio Free Europe.
Mm-hmm. And what about the show trial? How would this knowledge about Operation Splinter Factor revise our understanding of the show trials of the 50s and 60s, which also had the benefit for the CIA of destroying the American left, because it turned many in the left became neoconservatives or cold warriors when they learned of the show trials. But how should we understand those show trials in your assessment based on what you know about the Operation Splinter Factor?
Well, I think that it really needs to be reassessed, because I think it's with Operation Splinter Factor, it's obvious that paranoia and suspicion was stoked by the West to and sort of cause a crisis within the leadership of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. And it really would, I think, if people were more aware of Operation Splinter Factor and these sorts of things that would really change people's perspective on the Soviet Union as a whole and on Stalin and just that period in history in general, because, the country that's supposed to be the purveyor of freedom and democracy is, purposefully meddling in the affairs of other countries so as to literally, because they want to worsen the situation there so as to spark an anti-communist rebellion, and they want to create an atmosphere of paranoia. And a similar event that really fractured the left was the supposed, the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, which, some people at the time said that they thought there was CIA involvement, and they were then derogatorily referred to as tankies. But with Trump's recent declassification of the remaining JFK files, it was actually revealed that both the CIA and MI6 were involved in that uprising and training foreign fighters to send them in, and that what had been suspected for so long by the derided tankies was actually correct. And I think that, reinterpretations of these things in history would really lead to a reassessment of communism and socialism as alternative economic systems to capitalism, and also as to, what our own government has been up to for the past almost 100 years in terms of intelligence operations, and also the implications for, if that's what they were doing then, what are they doing today?
Hmm. Yeah, and well, I don't know if also you want to relate it because your discussion of defectors is interesting. How they use these defectors for psychological warfare purposes and overtly cultivated them. I wonder if you want to say something also about your research into the Soviet dissidents and how they were also used as kind of part of a weapon of the Cold War and made out to be these heroic figures when some, like Solzhenitsyn, had very ugly worldview in many ways and were supportive of the Vietnam War and could be considered in a way traitorous to their own people and may have also exaggerated some of the crimes of the Gulag. So go ahead. That's, I think, an important related topic, for people who want a more nuanced understanding of the Cold War. So go ahead.
Yeah, so it's Solzhenitsyn, his 3-volume work, The Gulag Archipelago, was really, at the time that it came out, it was really held up, and also, caused a lot of conflicts within the left. And as time has gone on, he wasn't a historian or a researcher, and he gives a lot of statistics as to the number of people that were interned in the Gulag and that died, and he doesn't really say how he gets these numbers. And throughout the 3 volumes, his numbers change and don't even match with the increase in the population in the Soviet Union at the time. But that aside, the CIA was very happy when this book came out and recognized how it could be used. And Solzhenitsyn was painted in the West, especially, as this heroic figure speaking out for freedom and all this. But actually, he really had a serious nostalgia for the Tsarist Russian Empire and had some quasi-fascist sympathies. Like, he admired Franco's Spain, for example, or yeah, he supported Vietnam War. But actually, later in his life, he started to he changed his views, and because, even at the time, he viewed the West with its democracy as like morally decrepit or something. And he was very towards later in life was very patriotic of Russia, and actually began to reconsider his demonization of the communist period, just because surely because he realized that after, the fall of the Soviet Union, what happened really wasn't good for Russia. And because he was so much of a nationalist, he sort of reconsidered the period of the Soviet Union that he had been most critical of, and at which, that part is never mentioned. And he was sort of, the more he became a Russian nationalist in his old age, he wasn't really talked about or held up in the West in the same way anymore, especially since, the effort in the West recently has really been to antagonize Russia again. But yeah, his works were used by the CIA and the another lesser known, I guess, I mean, he wrote about his time in the Gulag, but I wouldn't really say he was, I don't think he really considered himself a Soviet dissident per se, was Raoul Mishalimov, who Solzhenitsyn actually asked him to collaborate with him on the Gulag Archipelago, but Solzhenitsyn himself sort of acknowledged that it was a collection of camp folklore, and whereas in the West is taken as this extremely factual book instead of something that was, exaggerated. But
Well, and that's a lesson for today. How the NED uses these dissidents, from China, from Russia, from North Korea, makes like they're heroes, and yet they're often of dubious veracity in stuff they're writing about. They may be exaggerating certain abuses. They're not placing things in a larger context. They're not viewed very favorably in their own countries, and they're being used for a nefarious political agenda to advance U.S. empire, to destabilize and undermine these governments. Just like in the Operation Splinter Factor. And I mean, if we look at the human costs of that, it caused people to turn on each other. It caused more oppression. I mean, the U.S. claims to be supporting democracy, but these kind of programs force leaders to become more autocratic. When they're suspicious and paranoid for legitimate reasons, then they're going to clamp down more on dissent. So if people in the United States want to genuinely promote democracy, they have to expose these operations and stand against the CIA, which is working really against democracy. And that's what I think viewers should take away, why these programs are so pernicious. And it goes against the ideal of the country and what we purport to be standing for. So
yeah,
I'd like to just take one step back and just look at the word splinter factor. I mean, the goal is was to splinter the USSR. And the reason that was done is because if you break something up, it's much more vulnerable and it becomes an easier target for infiltration and exploitation. So that was the goal. And I just want to take another step back and say, how do we apply that today? And let's look at the paranoia that's going on right now in the United States. Right now, we have, the Biden administration weaponizing the CIA and the FBI against the Trump administration. And now we have the Trump administration weaponizing the CIA and the FBI against, liberals, so to speak. And, we have this dynamic of red states against blue states, blue cities, blue states against the federal government. We have a situation where we have the National Guard. That was just two members were just killed, and now they're going to put more National Guard in Washington, D.C. So you're seeing this kind of splinter factor and this kind of paranoia happening in the United States. So you'd say, well, why is that going on? And, we take many steps back and we don't see things necessarily as the United States against the Soviet Union or China. We tend to see things as the predator class. And we talk a lot about this techno totalitarian class that really is borderless. And it's very possible that the United States is right now in a splinter factor. And because we're seeing this pattern that you've described, and it's kind of a playbook. And if the
yeah,
United
I think
States,
Gloria, if I can just chime in with one or two
please.
brief points. Yeah, I think it's a strategy of divide and conquer that we may increasingly be seeing here in the United States, these manipulations that were used in foreign countries. And there's a lot of research that has shown that, and this was, a long time ago, you had an anti-imperialist movement, the Anti-Imperialist League, and they said that if America becomes an empire, it will lose its democracy. And I think that's what you're describing, that the method, and some historians have traced out how the methods that were used, overseas, have come back home. So I think they're using that same governing tactic here to divide the people and establish this kind of predatory rule. The other point I wanted to make was that we should view, I think you raised the point, Gloria, in your opening remarks, that, I think the way that the history is skewed and the way it's taught to students is that it's not presented how Eastern Europe was like a kind of semi-colony of Western Europe, and that the communist regimes, which are just presented as these evil regimes, actually, at number one, they fought the fascists, and they had a huge amount of support for standing up to Hitlerism and fascism. And number two, they were trying to transform the economy of Eastern Europe and Soviet Russia in a way that would end subordination to the West and Western corporation, at least in theory, and to escape this kind of neo-colonial type relationship and foreign control, of their businesses and industry and land, and also break the grip of oligarchs in their countries. And the CIA was on the side of counter-revolution and reaction and kind of restoring this kind of neo-colonial arrangement on those countries. And that's why so many of the population did support it at the time. If you go back in the 40s and 50s, they had a huge support. The original CIA Operation Rollback programs failed. The CIA was trying to run emigres to sabotage those governments, and it was a miserable failure. And that's why FDR had signed the Yalta. He understood. FDR was a much smarter leader than those that came after him, FDR and Wallace, because Wallace in particular, vice president, had traveled widely in the region and had an understanding of the political dynamic and why the communist governments had political strength at that time. So that's where the CIA came in with these nefarious programs. But as a historian, it's important to teach the real history, and we get this distorted history in our schools, our colleges. So again, I think your research is very important.
The other thing I just want Jayme to kind of speak a little bit about is who the CIA represents. It doesn't represent the American public.
No, the CIA represent the ruling capitalist class, as tied with the Rockefeller, and Dulles was connected with the big Wall Street banks. He worked for Sullivan and Cromwell, which represented the Wall Street banks. These companies, their clients were top Nazis, and he was involved with Prescott Bush and Averell Harriman. And these kind of people were actually traitors to the United States because they helped bankroll the Nazi regime, and they continued trading even after the U.S. went to war with Nazi Germany. And they were extreme right-wingers. As you said, they had fascist sensibilities. They were against any left-wing or social democratic government because that threatened their business interests. And particularly the nationalization policy adopted by the Soviet Union and Eastern European countries threatened Western corporate access to the natural resources of those countries. And that's why they were targeted for these kind of operations and demonized. And sure, they had their flaws, but as you point out, these flaws were deliberately stoked and maneuvered, and encouraged. And also, the Dulles, their uncle was Robert Lansing, who had been Wall Street's man, who took the U.S. into World War I, and he had greenlighted a loan that J.P. Morgan had made to Britain and France that basically enmeshed the U.S. in the First World War. So that's their lineage of the Dulles, and it represents what Gloria called the predator class. Elite Wall Street financiers and banks, for whom communists or leftists of any stripe are a major threat. And that's why they promote these very aggressive and nefarious and often criminal foreign policies. And yeah, it ultimately doesn't serve the interest of the American public. It stokes conflicts around the world, diverts our resources into weaponry and warfare, and it stows instability, violence, political oppression around the world, the kind of policy they advocate for. And that's why we're, uncontrolled. We want to build a genuine opposition movement to this kind of ruling strategy.
The other thing I want to point out is that I forgot my train of thought. Oh my God, my phone was ringing. Um, this is done to also, okay, to kind of brainwash our military, to brainwash even members of the CIA. Well, there's two key things that everyone should always focus on is that the CIA is based on a need to know basis and compartmentalized information. So, I'm sure most CIA assets believe that they're doing something for the US government that's and something for the US public that's good, because the actual motives, are very much controlled by very few people that are at the, most senior level. And so this whole thing must be maintained. So when you have a situation where you're saying, oh, these communist models are terrible or these socialist models are terrible, there's this fear that if you had a good model, I mean, the fear is that the success of these models might undermine the vulture capitalism in the United States. I mean, when you learn, okay, that like in Nicaragua, for example, you have universal health care. You have,
Yeah, and
subsidized
that's what they were
housing.
developing in Eastern Europe. And I spent time in Czechoslovakia and Prague, and a lot of people, older people, are very nostalgic about the communist era. They had free housing, free healthcare, good school, investment in public education. Those governments were claiming control over their natural resources. They were developing plans for industrialization, so Eastern Europe could actually compete with Western European firms. And that's why the Marshall Plan was such a weapon against them and threat, because it was huge U.S. subsidies to Western Europe industry and excluding Eastern Europe. They wanted to keep subordinate. And that's what it was all about, keeping the East subordinate and empowering the West and Western bankers and capitalists. And that's how the history should be understood. But it's not taught that way in school. It's taught that we're conditioned to believe the communists were evil and America stood for democracy. That's why these programs have to be suppressed, because it shows America didn't stand for democracy. They encouraged the most authoritarian tendencies in those governments deliberately.
And they're afraid of us asking for the same stuff that they have in other countries. Like they don't want us coming back and saying, well, gee, little Nicaragua, the size of like New York, New York State, has free healthcare. Why can't the
Yeah, why
wealthiest
can't we?
country in the world have free healthcare? So they don't want that blowback, that comparison. So they want to undercut that. So that's something else, is how important this propaganda is, not only to destroy these models so that you can exploit them, but also to prevent the knowledge that these other models are successful from, the United States wanting to replicate them.
Yeah. And one thing I would add is I think Shaenah's research is very significant, and I think maybe she or others can do also more research, like in the 80s era, how the CIA was behind these uprisings in Eastern Europe, and how there are a lot of fascistic element. What we see now in Eastern Europe is a lot of fascist-leaning governments taking root. With communism, discredited and destroyed, it hasn't created utopia at all. And that's why, if you go and travel in those countries, there's a lot of poverty, underdevelopment compared to Western Europe, and nostalgia for the communist period. And perhaps we'll see at some point a revitalization of the left there. But all that was destroyed, and the CIA, played a very important role, I think, extending through the 80s right up to the fall of communism. So I think that should be studied in greater depth, because there are good studies like on Latin America, Nicaragua. Somebody was commenting, but there aren't a lot of good academic study that trace out the CIA's role in Eastern Europe, which was very crucial. And yeah, these new documents are showing the CIA role in this Hungarian counter-revolutionary uprising. So I think it's a fruitful area for more scholarly research, and hopefully it could be better taught to youth in the future.
Yeah,
I was just wondering. Jayme usually puts up a wrap
Go
it
ahead,
up.
Shaenah. Yeah, you wanted to say something.
I was just gonna say I'd love to write about that in the future. I know, like for example, that the CIA sort of used like rock music and rock musicians coming. There was, I can't remember the name, but towards shortly before the fall of the Soviet Union, they had brought like, it was a Western backed big concert brought to Moscow and sort of used the youth culture and the longing for the cultural freedoms of the West and the goods it had to offer to sort of instigate, the fall of the Berlin Wall and the
Yeah,
fall of the
nothing better than
Soviet Union.
sex, drugs, rock and roll, and Hollywood to destroy your youth and have them think that things are better in the United States than back in the Soviet Union. And we talk a lot about that, and that was one of my the ones that really upset me. Every day Jeremy and I talk, and Shaenah, I'm sure the same with you too, is every day we learn how much we believed as children was an absolute and utter lie. and some things hurt more than others, and finding out that all of this rock music stuff that I loved, and I was a rock musician and still am, I guess, so was all manufactured because it breaks up the culture and has people focused on things outside of political activism. So
We better
anyway,
wrap it up.
yeah, I guess
wrap up.
we gotta wrap it up. So let's come back to our closing. And Shaenah, can you please tell our audience how they can follow your work?
Yeah, I have a Substack called The Red Letter where I post my writing, and I also have I co-host the Captive Minds podcast with Max Parry, which is available on YouTube, Captive Minds, and available on Substack as well. Also, under Captive Minds.
Well, the opinions you hear are ours and that of our guest, not those of WBAI, the Pacifica Foundation, or the Progressive Radio Network. That wraps up our show for today. This is Uncontrolled Opposition. I'm Gloria Guillo, joined here by Professor Jayme Kuzmarov. Remember to like and share our broadcast. Your kind support keeps us going. Please find us on Substack, Twitter X, and Podbeam. Thanks for tuning in. Hope to see you next week.
Okay, we're good.
Okay.
So we're still
Well,
live. Nobody take their
still live.
clothes off.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna have to go.
But, yeah.
But
Yeah.
thanks, Shaenah. Yeah, great research that you're doing, and yeah, I hope do more research in this area. And yeah, maybe you want to do some articles on the 80s, or that would be a great article on rock music. So
Yeah, I'd like to do that. Currently,
Yeah.
I would like you to not do that because I don't want to ruin my childhood memories.
You want to hold on to a few of them, huh?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, look, from my perspective, the 80s were fun, but that's because I wasn't politically aware yet. And now that I am, I look back on it and go, "Oh man, it was really a disaster." But I was watching Star Wars and Transformers and G.I. Joe. So,
All those
that was
good
a good
things.
time. It was a great time. But
Oh yeah,
no,
Shaenah,
that's a period that we do need to go in depth in, because my generation we ignore it because we were having too much fun.
John Spritzler, one of our friends, has a really good article, and you can find it on our Twitter and or X, however you can call it these days. Let's see if I can find it really. Okay, the truth about the Mayflower colonists that pro-capitalist propagandists Jeff Jacoby must hide. And it's really a great article about who were the Mayflower people, the I forgot the word, the Plymouth Rock and all of that stuff. The Pilgrims, that's the word I'm looking for. And how and all of that stuff. And it's really quite interesting. And he has this great perspective between the rich and the poor, or as we call it, the predator class and the prey. And since it's Thanksgiving or a day of mourning, depending on how you want to look at it, I will say Happy Thanksgiving, because it's a time where we can be at least with our families and have some time off to eat together and spend that time. But it's pretty interesting, and I really enjoyed John's article. Recommend it.
Okay, well, I got to run. Shaenah, if you can send me that CIA document related to the Hungary with the JFK file, we might publish that at the Covert Action. You mentioned the Trump release of these JFK files, and there's some documents that show CIA involvement in the Hungarian uprising of 1956.
I'll see if I can find it for you.
Okay, if you can, please send that. Okay, otherwise, thanks, guys. That was a good discussion, and have a great
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming on, Shaenah.
Thanks, Jayme,
for having me.
Take care.
Thanks, Shaenah. Thanks, Gloria.
Thanks, Jayme.
Yeah, well, I just want to say thanks to everybody. It's Thanksgiving after all, and so for those of us in the United States, we're gonna go and do our turkey dinners and everything like that. A lot of us will probably be watching football as well. That's something I used to do, but I gave that up. I don't do that anymore, and I don't miss it. It's really funny. I was 30 years, and
I'm
I don't
back in the
it.
kitchen, so I got to get in there.
Right. Okay,
Thanks,
so let's go ahead and wrap this up. Thank you for joining us today. This is Uncontrolled Opposition. We are a presentation of Pasta to Go by Craig Pasta Jardula, our executive producer, who was on last week, and I forgot to mention that little tidbit. But anyway, thanks for everybody watching. Thank you, Shaenah, for being here, and we will see you guys next week. Bye-bye.